Good afternoon, and thank you for that very generous introduction. If you want me to bore you about my career as a bus driver, I'm happy to talk to you after I've finished. It's not that exciting, believe me. And it's also an honour to be here and speak in front of you today, because I've been in some of the breakout sessions as well. There's an awful lot of communications excellence and awesomeness in the room, and if we can all absorb that today, I think that's absolutely fantastic. So yeah, great opportunity, and thank you to come and talk to you today about just two stories from my experience at Scarborough. I would like to point out that it says former head of communications and marketing at Scarborough, which is correct, but I'd like to just reassure you, just as a disclaimer before I go any further, that's not because I consistently misspelt the word public in news releases. It's actually because the council, along with the other districts and boroughs in North Yorkshire, was abolished at the end of March this year in favour of a new unitary, a single council to take responsibility for the whole of North Yorkshire. So a big change in local government where I'm based. If you've never been to the borough of Scarborough, 3 amazing seaside towns are our focus really. There they are there. We've got some beautiful countryside as well, some amazingly quaint coastal villages, and a big chunk of our borough sits inside the North York Moors National Park. And there is an unwritten rule that says in your adult life, and you all look to me to be adults, you must turn up at one of those places at some point to eat fish and chips. I'm very good at remembering faces, so I'll be keeping an eye out for you. Just in terms of the context for this place, because a lot of people don't know much about our borough, 3 figures which I think tell the story to a certain degree. That first one is that 108,000. That's the number of people who actually live in the borough of Scarborough. It's the second most populous place in North Yorkshire, second only to Harrogate, which is a district is very posh. It's at one end of the A61, we're at the other end of the A64, so some contrast there. But in 2019, we welcomed 8.8 million day visitors to our borough, second only to the number of people who turned up to have a look around London. So you can see that tourism drives the economy in the borough, and it's a big deal for us. But if you know anything about coastal towns, and you know anything about areas that rely on tourism for their economy, it sometimes means you can get suppressed things like wages and other stuff. That said, we do actually have some highly skilled jobs in our borough as well. A big engineering company called Plaxton's makes coaches and buses, and no, I've not been for the tour yet, which it exports internationally. We've also got Anglo-American, the mining conglomerate, which at the moment is in the middle of building a new mine to extract polyhalite from under the North Sea, and it's going to transport it to Teesside along a very long underground conveyor belt. And then on the top of the hill in Scarborough, looking down across South Bay, there's an outpost of GCHQ. A load of spooks sit up there listening, I presume, to what Putin and Kim Jong-un are talking about, and now I've mentioned it, probably me as well. So it just shows you there's a bit of contrast. There are some highly skilled jobs in the borough. And that 85% figure is all about the number of deprived households. 85% of the most deprived households in the whole of North Yorkshire, which generally is actually a fairly affluent place, live in the borough. So it's a place of contrasts. My first story this afternoon concerns something that happened to us at New Year's Eve on the 31st of December last year. And frankly, it began like any other ordinary New Year's Eve. I can't really remember what I was doing, probably cursing like I'm sure you would have done. The landlord at my local pub, who for one night of the year decided to charge everyone 10 quid to get in because he knew he had a captive audience. And I was at home when I received what I now think probably is a phone call I never would have expected. At first, I thought it was a joke, and it went something like this. We've got a walrus, it's in the harbour, and now we've got to cancel the fireworks. What do we do? Now, I've been in PR and comms for quite a while now, as Phil says, and a journalist before that, but I think this is probably by far the weirdest call I've ever had to deal with. And I love the fact that our colleagues, us as communicators and stakeholder specialists, have faith that we know the answers to everything. Of course, we know that we do. But I have to say, on that morning, my knowledge of fireworks and the behaviour of mammals was fairly limited. But I'm very happy to share this trivia with you now, because you never know when you might turn up on the chase in front of Bradley Walsh. Walruses, like dogs, don't like loud noises. Who knew that? And if you have a load of fireworks and you unpack them from their safety boxes, you cannot put them away again. And did you know fireworks also have explode by dates? So we're in a bit of a quandary. Do we go ahead with our fireworks or not? So that was interesting. As you can imagine, social media very busy, not lots of noise about Thor. This is just a snapshot. I mean, I could show you loads of stuff. This is the Sea Life Centre in Scarborough, which are providing us some advice. And as you can see, the chatter was quite busy. And a lot of people wanted to come down to see what Thor was up to. He'd been in Southampton a few weeks before, so there was a lot of interest in him. In fact, here he is on the quayside. not doing a great deal. This is what walruses do. It's very shy, as you'll see in just a minute. And for me, this walrus, Thor, presented us with 3 distinct communications challenges. The first one was about that message to the public: leave him alone. There you see, he's shy. He is a wild animal, don't go near him. He doesn't want to be disturbed, he's there for a rest. The second challenge was dealing with the media, because of course this suddenly was an interesting story for them. And if you are a public sector communicator, as many of you are, you know you never have crises in August, because basically the media will turn up because there's nothing else going on. Same applies, it would seem, to New Year's Eve. And then the other challenge for us was about how we manage that call for the fireworks to be called off. And the fireworks is a big deal for us in Scarborough, and potentially a bit of a backlash. And about 2 months beforehand, we'd cancelled a major charity bike ride through the borough because the weather conditions were so atrocious, and we got an awful lot of stick for making that decision, even though most of the people that would have gone to see it would have been in fairly dangerous conditions. So it's interesting. And as a communicator, you'll know sometimes you have to have weird conversations with your leaders of councils, or maybe chief officers, chief constables, housing association, chief execs. So I had to ring mine, and the call went something like this: "Hi Steve, Andy here, we have a problem. It's being caused by 1.5 tons of blubber." And for the first time, that wasn't a comment on the leader of the opposition. Fortunately, Steve, being a very pragmatic man, actually decided it made sense to cancel the fireworks, and so that's what we did in the end. And to manage that, dealing with that communications, what we actually did was we worked jointly with British Divers Marine Life Rescue, the charity that was looking after Thor, keeping an eye on him, to issue a joint statement, which confirmed it was their advice, plus experts who know about mammals, to actually cancel the fireworks. And they also said in this statement that they were supportive of the decision, which actually, for a change, a council was doing a good thing. Who knew that was going to be the case? So strangely enough, all of a sudden, the sentiment turned around. It's quite positive. As you can imagine, an awful lot of media interest. There's Thor on ITV. You know, a walrus turns up and then he cancels the fireworks. It got a bit interesting internationally. Although I do think, bloody cheek, British town, it should be Premier Seaside Resort, thank you very much. But then it goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. I'll allow you to read the words. I'm not going to make any comment. Actually, if I was speaking to Thor, I would have said, "Thor, don't panic. What happens in Scarborough stays in Scarborough." Sadly, it didn't for him. And then it went even more ridiculous, and I think Helene's gone home now, but we were on the news quiz.
New Year's Eve in London, you had a firework display that they spent millions on. And in Yorkshire, we had a walrus and no fireworks.
Scarborough Council cancelled the firework display because the walrus was there. But imagine if that was the only reason the walrus had turned up.
Yeah.
Quite possibly, who knows? But anyway, quite funny. I think the legacy, though, from Thor and what we learned was we got an awful lot of positive coverage out of it. And for a seaside town, a resort that relies on tourism, it was actually quite good news for us. We were in lots of magazines, news articles. Sky News Australia seemed to take a particular interest in it. I think there was a Danish television station that thought it was the biggest story ever to hit Denmark, which is quite bizarre. But anyway, good news for us. And so we were able to leverage Thor to a certain degree in some of the destination and tourism marketing that we did as a result of that. In terms of lessons to be learned, I think there are, 4 serious ones and a bit of a laugh. I think the first one is, I know as comms people, we prepare ourselves for every eventuality. Absolutely. But I think once you've considered all the possible eventualities, go back to the beginning and say, is that possibly the worst thing that could happen to us, or the most bizarre, or the most bonkers thing, and then plan again for that. The other thing is, I also think it's worth thinking about how we are prepared as communicators for one thing to cause a load of communications challenges in our case. A bit like when you drop the pebble into still water and the ripples go out. The other big thing is, I know most of us work in very small teams, it's about the whole how you mobilise out-of-office resources. Scarborough Council at the time, when it existed, closed between Christmas and New Year. Great if you're an officer, because you basically sat around and did nothing, but not so brilliant for customer services point of view, and believe me, very difficult when it came to mobilising support at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on New Year's Eve. Mind you, I suppose it was better than if it was 2 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day. So I think that's an issue for us. And the other thing is, of course, as I'm sure most of you would do this anyway, and I appreciate I'm probably preaching to the converted here, sometimes you can use others for supportive messages to tell your story. And then just on a bit of a cheeky one, and I guess that I know that I'm being very silly here, but it is after lunch, so bear with me. Feel free to throw the popcorn if you think this is terrible. If you're about to have a crisis, you know one's coming down the line, all you need to do is find a cuddly mammal somewhere, maybe a penguin from this morning, plonk it outside your respective headquarters building, and it will be a great distraction. So that's Thor. And the other story I want to talk to you about goes back to 2019. This is about engagement and how we build trust with our residents, or how we try to when the council existed. Scarborough was an interesting place in 2019. Previous to that, long political administration, same colour for very many years. And they had a really odd attitude towards kind of communications and engagement, frankly, in that they didn't bother. And this was the example I once heard. I wasn't there at the time, but famously a councillor at Scarborough once said, well, it's not like our residents have a choice. They can't choose to go and do the big shop at Morrison's or Sainsbury's. They can only take their services from us. So A, we don't need to communicate, and why should we bother engaging with them? Now, I know as a kind of there'll be a collective kind of sigh of kind of depression at that, and I think actually the same for me, really. What a weird attitude to have towards the people who are paying council tax and using your valuable services. Betting. Anyway, odd. 2019, the pivotal moment for the council. Elections happened, and what happened? That continuous administration for many years lost. And a bit of a shock for them, I have to admit. I think they found that quite a surprise that they'd lost out. We had a new administration, Rainbow Coalition came in with a completely different attitude. We also got a new chief executive in 2019 who was annoyingly young, annoyingly handsome, annoyingly brilliant, but so there's three annoying things about him. On the flip side, he got the value of communications. He understood us as communicators. We are enablers for our organisation. We have a strategic role to play in what we're doing, so that was a good thing. And under his watch, the council embarked on a massive consultation programme. Now, and again, I know this is something you do in your organisations on a very regular basis, but believe me, we were starting from not even base zero here. This was base -1 probably in terms of the previous approach. So as you can see, it was all about changing, building a better borough for our residents. And it was the biggest thing the council had done for a very long time. And it also got the greatest number of results for a long time. And here's some of the results. If you work in local government, that top 10 stuff up there, you won't be surprised that dog poo, loos, clean and green, all this kind of stuff is really important. And we also did some, I say we, I can't take the credit for it, I wasn't there at the time. But the council did analysis on a ward-by-ward basis on the basis that perhaps if there were some specific issues in those wards, that could be some segmented comms. We could run a specific campaign or something or other. And of course, as communicators, we are pretty handy with colouring in pens. If you're a designer in the room, I know that's a very kind of fatal thing to say, but actually we're pretty good at that. But we are also scientists when you think about it. It's a mixture. We're that fine line. And really, as communicators, I'm sure you're doing it in your organisations now, whatever you do to communicate is based on solid insight and intelligence, and you've got some good data to back you up. And of course, what this did was it formed the basis for our corporate plan. And from that, we hung the communications plan off of it. I won't bore you with all the details, but the kind of real thing that sort of shone out for us is about the need to have a direct conversation with our residents. That's not to say the local media didn't have a role to play. Yes, they were there to hold us to account, but we had one weekly local newspaper which hardly anyone read. The local radio station just been bought by Bauer Media and was about to become a massive kind of conglomerate. It wasn't going to be much use for us. So what we chose to do was have this more direct conversation and try and spark some other engagement. And I know, again, this is hardly going to be a revolution for some of you in your organisations, but you've got to see it from the prism of where we were. So we decided to launch a newsletter, and we used the pandemic almost as the springboard for that. The reason being it was easy to argue for the resource to pay for this, frankly, because we were having to get those health messages out during the pandemic, so it's quite important. And of course, as you can see there, Thor featured in our January edition this year because, of course, we wanted to reflect on the fact he was still there. And we were really pleased with some of the reception we got to this, and the figures sort of speak for themselves, really. So this applied almost, I think I took this calculation almost at the very end of the existence of the organisation, so back end of March. We had short of 40,000 subscribers. In a borough of 108, we thought that was quite a good result. And most of that was organic growth. It was not like we started with 38,000 and we just built it up. So we were very pleased with those figures. And because we based most of the stuff we did on insight and intelligence, in our resident survey, you can see here that some of the figures suggest that this new engagement, this new approach, this direct conversation was making a difference. So the informed rating had gone up in a couple of years. Maybe as the satisfaction's place to live had gone up, only a little bit, admittedly, but we're going in the right direction. The 52% overall satisfaction with the council, if you work for the LGA will say, well, that should be in the mid-60s. So we clearly had a way to go, but sadly, of course, we were about to be ended. And then what we also discovered, for the first time the council's ever done a media consumption survey. It's worth doing. You know, we were talking about it in the housing breakout session earlier on, actually asking your residents for how they get their news. And pleasing for me, as part of the team, that actually the residents' news seemed to be resonating. So that was quite good. And we also asked, how would you like to get your news about us, and email turned up, as you can see, 67% as pretty popular. Seems a bit odd in 2023 talking about email as a popular channel, but actually for companies like Granicus and others, that's great news because that's really fundamental to their business model, frankly. So it was good. Learning points from the newsletter, and again, we were talking about this whole issue of tone of voice earlier on in the housing session, really, and goes back to what Helena was telling us this morning. Actually, the tone is really important. Public sector is quite risk-averse, I find, in the times I've done stuff in public sector, but actually being friendly, being personable, being human. We're humans after all. We should just kind of find a way of extending that, really. So tone of voice is right. We never refer to ourselves as a third person, because if you say, we're from Scarborough Borough Council, it makes you sound like you're cold, old, and unapproachable, and it's very them and us, so we didn't want to do that. We did have a feedback loop. My idea, oh dear, what a mistake that was. So in terms of Helena's 500 mistakes, that's probably 499 of mine. So in this thing, as well as obviously being able to opt out for GDPR purposes, I had a thing where it said, if you like this newsletter, forward it to a friend if you find it useful. But conversely, if you think it's a load of rubbish, then we'd like to know about it. And here's a link to my email address. Bloody hell, I had loads of emails, mainly the people of Whitby moaning about the stories about Scarborough, the people of Scarborough moaning about the people of Whitby, and finally people just having a whinge generally. But anyway, I thought it was quite good, and what it proved to me, I know everyone says they're very fast to complain, slow to praise, but it meant that if I got a comment about the 5th story, someone's read the first 4 stories. So I thought, actually, it does work. For me, I'm quite happy to deal with complaints, and I took a bit of a kind of maybe a odd pleasure in replying to some of these things. Consistency of message and complementary content, I think that makes sense. You'll be doing this in your organisations already. Visual interest, if we were picture-led stuff, it got a huge amount more interest. The opening rates went up, and most of our average open rates for these newsletters were in the 50s to 60s, sort of maybe mid-50s, which according to Granicus, because that's the platform we used, they said that's actually very good if it compared to other public sector organisations. We didn't include councillors. I've often asked, how did you get away with that? Well, we didn't include them from the start, and the reason being I didn't want it to be seen as a propaganda thing. I wanted it to be seen as an information tool from the council. And Helene, it's almost like we read the script together. Experiment and be brave. I mean, I have to say, hers is 70%. Mine's more like 30 sometimes, and I do live to regret that on occasions. Is it about right? Does it feel in the gut, and I'm going to get on with it? So I think that's worth bearing in mind. Be brave. I'm firmly signed up to the idea that you go and do it first, and you seek penance afterwards. But maybe that's just me. That's what happens when you freelance. You can be a bit more crazy. In terms of going next, well, what we decided to do to extend this whole piece really was we wanted to go and do some new stuff, and so we launched a podcast, 2 in fact. And this is just a screen grab from our podcast training. The guy bottom left, Adrian Stirrup, he's the podcast guru. If this is something you're interested in doing in your organisations, he's the man to talk to, absolutely brilliant. And the guy with the ear pod in the top there, that's the leader of the council. He was fully signed up to this. In fact, when you have the leader of the council on side, it makes life a lot easier. So we launched 2 podcasts. One was called Boroughcast. It was an extension, effectively, of Residents' News. It was a kind of the audio version of that. The other one was called In Conversation With, and we invited the leader of the council. So it was political with a small p. He was able to express an opinion. He talked about policy decisions and stuff like that, and actually got an awful lot of interest. People would ask him questions as a result. This is Apple's podcast page, but look carefully on the old, people who listen to your podcast, listen to that. So all about disasters, dictators, and black box down. I don't know if that's based on the content or just some kind of crazy algorithm. But anyway, it worked quite well. And Steve himself was pleased with it. In fact, he's recorded a short video just to kind of explain what he thought of it from a political point of view.
From a political perspective, I had 2 goals for the podcast. Firstly, reaching new audiences through less traditional mediums in ways that had the potential to be more convenient for the listener, but also to show that people in politics were just ordinary people who were trying to do their best for the communities they served. When we started this journey in podcasting, I have to admit I was nervous. I was used to standing up in front of a full council meeting and expressing my views, but this felt different. The way we did it, almost a fireside chat with friends, made it easy to get my points across in a way that didn't sound condescending. It was all done without any rehearsal or pre-knowledge of questions or topics that we discussed. As it turned out, I needn't have worried. I was overwhelmed by the number of listeners we achieved in a few months. The opportunity we gave listeners to ask me questions was really well received, and I was surprised at the interest people took in local and national issues. I think one of the best things about the podcasts is the opportunity to engage with a wide range of people of all ages and views. We're told that engaging young people in politics is hard to achieve. If our podcasts do nothing else, I hope they do that.
So that's Steve. Thank you, Steve. There's just some thoughts finally on the kind of podcasting issue. So as you can see, he was quite happy about it, which is very pleasing. And like I say, if you've got the leader of the council on side, that's great news for you. We didn't do this for quite a year. We hadn't quite got to a sort of first anniversary of this, but we got 2,000 downloads, which we thought, as we were starting from a low base, that was good. The one thing we didn't do very well is that penultimate bullet point. We just weren't clever enough at promoting the content across our channels, which was, I think, a mistake for us. We're on Alexa. It might not work anymore, but if you go home tonight and talk to your smart speaker and say, play me podcast from Scarborough Borough Council, you should get a positive response. Our long-term ambition was to actually get to the point where you could say, hello, Alexa, tell me about the news from Scarborough Borough Council, and it would give you a little bulletin or some information back, which is what we wanted to try and do, but sadly the rug was pulled from underneath us. The Armed Forces Day national event was massive for Scarborough. Had over 110,000 people turned up in one day. We did 2 specials around that, by far the most downloads, but the one we did about the Queen dying this time last year, it just bombed. Nobody was interested whatsoever. And actually it took an awful lot of effort to bring some voices together to recall about the Queen coming to the borough. One of our colleagues listened to every single episode, bless him, so we took his listening figures out of it, but we're very flattered that he bothered. It's much more complicated than you think, actually, podcasting. You think you just grab a microphone and start talking about a lot of old nonsense. It probably needs to be a bit more structured than that, but I do think it's worth the effort. Like I say, promote your content if you're going to go down this road, and I really encourage you to, especially when it comes to articulating some of the stories you're trying to tell about your organisations. Promoting that content is really important, and frankly, give it a go. What have you got to lose? I mean, if it's really dreadful, all you need to do is press the delete key, and nobody will ever know. So there you go. Those are my 2 stories from Scarborough. It's either going to put you off what we've done, or hopefully you'll find that's useful and you might learn something. But I really appreciate you listening, and thank you very much for listening to me today. Thank you.
Cheers, Andy. Thank you for that. Again, we're open to questions. Hannah's got the microphone. Any questions for Andy? Oh, right at the back. You might want to pass it back, Hannah, rather than throwing it all the way up there. We don't want to knock anyone out yet.
Cheers, thank you. Just on your podcast, could you just tell us a little bit more about how you were promoting that? What sort of channels? We're starting that off at Manchester City Council at the minute, but it's not for a more general news bulletin. It's more specifically focused on a health poverty campaign that we're working on. So just a bit of insight for us starting off, really.
We were doing something slightly different to you. We were doing something slightly different to you. We used our shared channels and own channels that we had, really, but I don't think we were clever enough about it. We weren't structured enough. So there's a lot of cross-promotion between Residents News, which had 40,000 subscribers. And I kind of thought, well, if we put something at the top of Residents News, everyone's going to immediately download the podcast and listen to it. Clearly, the answer was they didn't do that. What we probably needed to do is be more clever about promoting what was actually in each specific episode, so being more specific about the content that time, rather than just saying, oh, we've launched a podcast and go and listen to it, because that's not an invite, almost not that invitation to go and listen. So that's what we were doing. It would have been really helpful if we got our partners maybe as well to do some promotion. But again, we were just so excited that it was out there, we kind of really didn't think about the big picture, I suppose, and that's where we missed out. So that would be a learning point for me to think carefully about. You can generate some amazing content, but if you don't promote it, no one's going to listen to it, and that's where I think we led ourselves down. So I'd suggest looking at partner opportunities to promote, whether a partner will put a post on, be very specific about what the content is in that podcast. It will probably vary from episode to episode. And there are loads of techniques for how you do that. You can create things for social channels. Adrian was very good at teaching us about that on the training, but we didn't actually utilize that bit. But yeah, I think put it in places, partner, shared and owned channels.
Without wishing to over-promote Andy as well, he is available, I'm sure, as now as a freelancer to help you out with that. Right, okay, any more questions? Anyone else? No. I do know for a fact that Andy did run over John Prescott with a bus once.
Oh, correction, I nearly ran him over. He stepped out of the way just at the right moment.
Kirsty.
Who named the walrus? Did you name it yourself? Did you run a competition? Because
No.
I noticed it wasn't really in any of the media coverage, but you kept referring to the walrus as
Well,
Thor.
we were told that's what his name was because Thor had previously turned up in Southampton. He was on a place called Cowshot Beach, and I think that's where he was given the name by, I don't know whether it was the British Divers Marine Life Council Rescue or some other specialist. But that was his name, and apparently, again, mammals, a bit like fingerprints, you can actually identify walruses from one from the other because of distinctive markings on their skin. And what they did was they took some high-resolution pictures of Thor, the walrus that turned up in Cowshot, and again, when he arrived in Scarborough and realised it was 99% the same animal. So no, we didn't. But the one thing I didn't talk about, which is very sweet, is a load of children in a far-off tiny primary school on the other side of the country in Cumbria got to find out about Thor and wrote us a load of letters with pictures of him drawn up and saying, we hope he gets home and everything else. It was so sweet. We actually did a Teams interview with them and put that in one of the podcasts because it was such fun. These little kids all kind of drawing pictures of this walrus. It was quite funny. But no, sadly, I can't take the credit for that. Somebody much more into mammals than I am named him for us.
All right, cool. Any more questions before we move on to the Ellie Awards? Golden Ellies. No? Yeah, sorry.
Gosh, yeah.
It's lighter than it looks, isn't it?
Yeah, it's misleading. No, I was just from Georgia from West Midlands Police. We do a lot of emails, newsletters, and try and find the sweet spot, I suppose, engaging with people. So just want to say thank you for giving your list of top tips around that. I feel like in the public sector and policing, a lot of superintendents, a lot of chiefs want their picture, a lovely pose picture on there, but actually I think that's given us some reassurance that we don't need to have that as our content. And we can actually focus on that local community stuff and actually things that matter to local people. So yeah, just thanks for giving that, because that's some reassurance there.
Oh, my pleasure. I think, to be honest, you took the tone we took with the newsletter as if we were talking to a resident down the pub. So if we're trying to explain a planning decision or a policy decision or something we're going to do with their money, that's how we approached it. And in fact, the clearance process was it never went any higher than me for this stuff. It never went up to the chief executive because I didn't want, as much as he was very talented and annoying and all those things, I didn't want him interfering with it because I think he'd turn it round into kind of hello, Scarborough Borough Council and all that, and it just wouldn't have the right level of engagement, that right tone. So I think whether we got it right every single time, I don't know. Some of the emails I received complaining about saying, why are you mucking about? You know, you're supposed to be the council. You can't address me like this. But actually, I think for all the complaints about that, we had more people saying, yes, this is actually really useful, and I do read it.
And did you have people like responding on social media like from those newsletters, or did you have things that reached local news from those newsletters? Because I think sometimes that's in the public sector we run the risk of putting out stories that are really good, lovely worded, PR central, and then they sometimes get forwarded on, picked up in residents groups, and then saying like, oh, this is what they're doing, and then there's kind of like comments and a narrative going on outside of what we can control. So have you ever had an instance where you've put out a story and it's kind of gone in its own direction and you've had to like give statements about that, or?
Not fortunately from Residents News, no, that wasn't my experience at Scarborough, but we were reversioning our content all the time really, so we would still issue a news release to the media, but I was quite surprised because, I mean, a former journalist, I can say this, I can get away with it. Journalism these days is more about journalism. So if we put something in Residents News, it was quite 20 minutes later, it would appear on the local radio station website, almost copied and pasted. Well, great, tick, I've done my work there then, haven't I? I can go home now. So it's interesting how the media clearly think it's also the content's worth using for their own channels as well, and doing that copy and paste is quite bizarre, frankly, and as a former journalist, it horrifies me that's the case, but well, it works for me.
Yeah, I think the other key there is using different channels, isn't it? So I know we've been very sort of social, digital focused in a lot of our chat earlier, but obviously email is still a very pertinent channel for lots of your customers, citizens, your community. So having that multi-channel approach and that joined up approach definitely seemed to work for Andy at Scarborough as well. Any more questions before we move on? No? Okay. Thanks, Andy. Cheers.